Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. For Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast with Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board here. Hope you had a great week. I had an okay week for myself, but certainly it could have been better, to be sure. But anyways, I hope that you're going to have a good weekend here as we're looking, but and if do take a few moments, if you would, to register for our podcast. Make sure you're getting all the latest editions. Hit the bell. Of course, if you also go on Rumble, which is where I post my video, it's on YouTube. That's posted by Franklin, and I post mine up on Rumble. Just look under Wildlife Control Consultant, and you'll find it there. If you have questions, comments, perhaps suggestions for a new show, you can certainly reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Sometimes people are asking me if I do some consultation. The answer is yes, I do. I do charge for personalized consultation. However, one of the ways you can get free consultation, of course, is ask some questions that you would want me to answer, and perhaps I'll make a podcast out of it. And then you would get that information for free, just another way. I do have a lot of articles online. You can just simply search for my name, Stephen Vantassel. There are very few. That's Stephen, and then Vantassel, V as in Victor, Antassel. And that's another way to get a hold of me. Just do a Google search on that, or a DuckDuckGo search, and you'll find a whole host of articles that I've written. Chances are I've touched on a topic that you could be interested in. So I haven't posted everything that I've written up on my academia.edu site, but I continue to add more periodically. I'm kind of running out of. I got most of them up, but there's a few outliers that I haven't done as of yet, but I will probably get to them in the next coming months or so. But chances are there's a wealth of information there. And again, that is all free in terms of that you can download that. And of course, there's other materials out there elsewhere. If you Google my name, a lot of material out there. Of course, I also have several books on the market. You can see some of them listed up behind me up on the wall. And so things like the Wildlife Removal Handbook, 3rd edition, the Wildlife Damage Inspection Handbook, 3rd edition, revised. I also have republished Phil Nichols' book, Wildlife Pest Control. And you can also, and I also have one from Dr. Frischman that I've reprinted, and I'm presently in the process of revising it. So those products are relatively cheap, although the Wildlife Damage Inspection Handbook is still $75 post-paid, because that's color, 8.5 by 11. There's a lot of technical information in that, but if you want to really step up your game on damage inspection, that is the way to go. It talks about the methodology, talks about the processes of various locations, calendar, eyeshine, and then I have basically various chapters on each specific species or species group. Talks about key things to look for in terms of their damage. Where a lot of your publications, you go out there, they'll teach you how to do tracks and this sort of thing. Mine is designed for wildlife damage, particularly in an urban, suburban context. And the damage situation there is much different. Don't spend a lot of time on tracks. Why? Because in compacted soil, you don't really find a whole lot of tracks. It's hard to get a track on concrete, unless the animal has dirty feet or wet feet, that sort of thing. But anyways, a lot of information. But if you want to have a personalized consultation, you can certainly reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Happy to talk with you about that. It's a 1 hour minimum, and then it's 10-minute increments after that. All right. What's today's topic going to be on? Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about a book listed here, Key Questions in Urban Pest Management, a study and revision guide, written by Partho Dhang, Philip Kohler, Robert Pereira, and Daniel D. Dye II. Now, most of those individuals I don't know, but Daniel Dye II, typically he doesn't have his full name on there on Facebook, but you might know him by the beautiful macro photos he posts in the pest cemetery area. He is a macro photographer and does some wildlife photography too in terms of snakes, but he does a lot of macro work in terms of insects. And look him up, Daniel Dye II, and he is an author in this as well. Primarily, he does some of the illustrations in here, particularly some of the photos in particular. But I would suspect he also had some work in the book as well. But I'm familiar with Daniel Dye. He's sort of a friend of mine, not a close friend, but certainly a friend. But he's helped write this particular book. And it's basically, as it sounds, it's key questions. Now, when I originally heard the title, I thought, key questions, are they looking at an analysis about issues involved in pest control that need to be evaluated, like the issue of IPM? Is it really cost effective? Is it not cost effective? And I did not understand the title as the way it was. So when I got a copy of the book to do a review on, that's being published in the Journal of Pesticide Safety Education, I was looking at this and I was like, oh, I misunderstood what this book was all about. And what it is a book that collects a number of questions that can be used to quiz yourself or your employees to help them recapture and reinvestigate and reactivate information they may have learned in the past. And so one of the ways you can study information to help burn that into long-term memory is to do a question and answer type modality. So let's say you're having a situation where you're learning information and you're like learning. Well, the way to really activate that in terms of really embed it into your memory is to use question and answer, so it forces your mind to recapture that information, and that helps lock it into long-term memory, because you really don't know if you know something if you can't answer questions about it. The challenge, of course, is how you come up with good questions that are going to cover the breadth of material for urban pest control. Now, the vast majority of this, of course, is on insects, and this isn't an insect podcast. This is Living the Wildlife, where we deal with vertebrates. However, it does have a chapter on vertebrate pest control. And since many of you are dealing with insects as well, a lot of our audience is also not just doing vertebrate control, they're also doing pest control, I thought it'd be appropriate to certainly give a shout out to Daniel Dye in his book and let you become aware of it, particularly if you have employees that you want to have quiz questions for, as well as if you're looking to perhaps prepare yourself for maybe the ACE exam. This may be something you want to use to help you prepare for that particular exam. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a study guide for the ACE exam. That's not what I'm saying at all. The ACE exam, as I understand it, is undergoing some revision. One of my criticisms about the ACE exam, I've done a blog on this, is that they need to have a single book, a single resource that technicians can then use to prep for the exam, and saying all the questions that you're going to be asked are going to come from this book. Unfortunately, that's not the way it's presently done. And my personal opinion, I think that's unfair, because they're telling you to read a variety of books, and I think that's too high of a level for what the ACE exam should be, because it's sort of like if you have an exam on on raccoons, for instance, or excuse me, on wildlife control, and you ask the question, how many young does a typical female raccoon have? Well, you can read one publication and it may say 4 to 6, and another publication will say 3 to 5. Well, that's all well and good, but when it comes to the multiple choice exam and you have one answer that says 3 to 5, and the other answer says 4 to 6, which one are you supposed to pick? Because depending on which literature you read, it could be either one, right? And so that's my criticism about the ACE exam. Not that it's asking questions about raccoons. It's not asking questions about raccoons. But if the same way with insects, in other words, one particular publication may have a certain amount of data in terms of how long it takes for an insect under normal conditions to, come through the chrysalis, and another publication may have a different time. And so how does that relate to the particular question that we have? So I think that's unfair. That's why I think for the ACE exam, there should be one book or one manual that says all the questions are based on this. Now, they need to make it thicker, all well and good, but at least you know everything within the walls of that particular manual are fair game. And that's at least limits your universe for how you're supposed to study for that exam. I think they would have a lot more passing rates at that particular point, simply because you wouldn't have that type of confusion. Now, they may have, if they have questions based on scenarios, I think that's fair game as well, because you should have some general principles about how to implement pest control based on scenario basis. And I have that's certainly fine. That may not obviously be within the book, but when it's asking sort of these objective questions, those should be within the confines of that particular book. And presently, I think it's undergoing revision in this regard. So I'm not just trying to throw ACE under the bus, but when I was studying for it, that was very frustrating for me, especially as someone who was by no means an expert in insects. So this particular book can help you in two ways. One, it covers a host of aspects of urban pest control. Let me go down a little bit of the chapters list of the table of contents to kind of give you a feel for what this particular book covers. It's written quite well, in fact, but let me get to the table of contents here and list out some table of contents for you. So it has, in the preface and introduction, books referred to and for further reading. So you have resources that they recommend for further reading if you wish. But chapter 1 is Introduction to Urban Pest Management. Chapter 2 is Pest Identification. 3 is Mosquitoes. Chapter 4 is Bed Bugs. Chapter 5 is Flies. Chapter 6 is Cockroaches. Chapter 7 is Subterranean Termites. Chapter 8 is Drywood Termites. Chapter 9 is Powder Post Beetles and Wood Pests. Chapter 10 is Ants. Chapter 11 is Fleas, Ticks, and Mites. Chapter 12 is Sporadic Pests. We would call those occasional invasives, occasional species or accidental species that come into the building. You have Stored Product Pests in Chapter 13. Chapter 14 is Rodents. Chapter 15 is Birds and Bats. Chapter 16, Pesticides and Formulations. Chapter 17, Handling Pesticides. Chapter 18, Integrated Pest Management. And the last chapter contains the answers. So these are all objective questions, by meaning there's going to be, it's either going to be true, false. I don't think, if memory serves, there are a few true, false in here, but most of them are multiple choice, typically with 4 answers. One of the things you have to keep in mind with this particular book is that sometimes there is more than one correct answer. So this is something I did criticize the book for, and that is sometimes the question, because in America, because this book is actually written for an international audience, you can say, I don't want to be learning about insects outside the country. It is primarily I would say 90 to 95% of what's in here is all relevant to the United States. So you're not going to be really learning anything that's that much that's going to be outside the U.S. But for those of you listening outside the U.S., understand that this is an international authorship. I think 3 different continents are represented in the authors here, so that they bring some of that flavor to that. And that, I think that's a good thing, because some of these invasive insects, you never know. But, a cockroach is a cockroach is a cockroach. And whether it's in Indonesia or whether it's in South Florida, a lot of those habitats can be the same. So maybe learning a question or two about a cockroach in Indonesia is not going to hurt anything. You never know. For those of you in the southern portion of the United States, that may be valuable information. But if it's not, you just simply skip it and don't use that particular question teaching your workers or even teaching yourself, and just focus on the U.S. But again, 95% is going to be all America and North America type settings. So don't sweat the few questions that have an international flavor to them. But some of the multiple choice questions, a few of them have more than one answer. Now, one of my criticisms, as I kind of hinted before, was that they should have given you a heads up on that. Typically in America, when you have a multiple choice question, only one question is true. That's the one you're supposed to pick. But in this particular manual, you have to keep in mind that there's a few answers where there's it's not just A, it's going to be A and B. And there isn't an answer that says both A and B. You have to know that A and B are the correct answers. And how do you know that? Well, when you go to the back of the book, it'll sometimes list 2 different letters as answers for that particular question. There are not many, only a handful. But there are situations where, like here we have in chapter 13, question 13, the answer is both A and C. Who would have thought, right? So that kind of, I found that to be a little disconcerting. Maybe that's a different policy in European multiple choice questions. But here in the U.S., our practice is that it's always assumed there's only one correct answer unless the question explicitly states more than one answer can be checked. Okay, so that's just one thing to keep in mind. But again, not a big deal, but it does occur occasionally. Now, of course, with a true and false question, there's only going to be one correct answer. You're not going to just pick both true and false, but this is just for the multiple choice. The photos in here, of course, you can see some of the beautiful photos here by Daniel Dye. They're just absolutely splendid. I sort of covet his ability to create beautiful macro photos. They are a thing to behold in this chapter. So how many questions do you have per chapter? Typically, it's anywhere from 20 to 30 questions per chapter. So that's a fair amount. So when you think about looking at, 18 different chapters, that you have anywhere from 360 to over 400 questions in this particular book on urban pest management. So if you're looking for a guide to help you rather than trying to create your own questions, this is something that can be useful for you to help quiz your technicians and use it as a learning moment. Again, what is the value of quizzes? Quizzes help activate different parts of your brain in terms of your education. So when you're learning something, it forces you to recapture that information to answer the question. And that helps, again, burn that into long-term memory. It reactivates, because a lot of times we know things or we think we know it. And then if someone asks you a question, you're like, oh, I'm not sure. What's the right answer here? This helps preload that for you so that you're asking the questions in a context where you can get the answers. So that way, when a client is asking the question, you can immediately recapture it. This is a powerful learning tool, and it's something that can be very helpful. So that's the first advantage of using a book like this, or just using quizzes in your training methods, whether for yourself or for your workers. The second reason why a book like this is valuable is it teaches you how to handle test-taking stress. One of the challenges I've heard of people like, well, I just blanked. And this is where stress, where you get an adrenaline dump in your body, it's the mind killer. When we have an adrenaline dump in our body, when we're afraid of something, we have an adrenaline dump. That is designed to do a couple of things. Excuse me, that's my fire department call there. It's part of their daily call out test of our activation system. So sorry about that. But when you're having an adrenaline dump because of fear, it actually lowers your thinking capacity because your body is in a fright and flight mode of thinking. This is why when you have people that have an adrenaline dump, they can be getting into some violent fights and then they can't remember what they did because they kind of go to that, some people call it the animal brain. We have that part of our brain in the back of our head that just brings us down to just the survival mode versus our upper brain, which is our reasoning and thinking mode. Okay. I'm not a big fan of that particular analogy, but there is some neurological evidence to support that, to say our brain does, different parts of our brain do different functions. That's certainly something I would concur with. But nevertheless, when we have an adrenaline dump, it brings we lose some of our ability to think rationally. The way you overcome that adrenaline dump is to train yourself not to fear the test. One of the ways you overcome fear is to do what you're afraid of by doing it in a safe environment and by having questions in a non-dangerous, threatening way, like you're going to take a test and if you fail it, it doesn't ruin your career, then you can learn to overcome some of that test anxiety. The third advantage with taking a quiz like this, taking questions like this, and testing yourself is that you learn how to read questions and learn basic test-taking skills. There's a skill for how to handle multiple choice questions. There's a skill with understanding how to read the question to say to yourself, is this going to be a situation where is this a true statement or is this a false statement? Remember, when we have a true statement, everything about that statement has to be true. Because if you just have one element of that statement that's false, then the answer is false. So just by statistics, you're more likely going to have false questions than you are true questions, because it's hard to make a question where the question is true as opposed to when the question is false, right? It's very easy to make a false question. So those are things that you learn when you're taking your fake quizzes so that you can prepare yourself for both life and if you're looking for certification exams. And these are powerful ways to help you, remember the material you're supposed to know, get over test anxiety, and 3, develop better test-taking skills so that you don't get thrown by multiple choice questions and you know how to read a question properly, to analyze it, to find the correct answer. Because when you're dealing with a multiple choice question, you're often going to have you have the right answer, of course, then you're going to have several distractors. These are answers designed to sort of throw you off. They may be partly true, but they're not true enough to be the answer. And it takes a little bit of skill and discipline to know that, because you have to know what answer is false to know what answer is true. And even if you don't know what the true answer is, if you can identify some distractors, you increase the odds of choosing the right answer. Okay, so those are very helpful tools. So what is the book again? Key Questions in Urban Pest Management, a Study and Revision Guide. Now, the word revision may have thrown you like it did me. I had to look it up, and it seems to be a British understanding the word revision. It's basically like a study. It's a way of forcing you to remember what you were taught. So that's what they mean by revision guide. It helps you revise your understanding of the material by asking questions. It's a teaching method, and it can be a powerful one because it's quick, it has a fast response, and it helps burn information into long-term memory. So what is this book again? Key Questions in Urban Pest Management, a Study and Revision Guide by Partho Dhang, D-H-A-N-G, Philip Kohler, K-O-E-H-L-E-R, Roberto Pereira, and Daniel D. Dye II. and you can pick this up. It's published by Cabi Press, C-A-B-I. I hope you can all read that well enough. C-A-B-I, Cabi Press. Published in 2022. Soft cover, and again, there's probably about 400 questions in here. It would be my guesstimate. I didn't count all of them, but there's a fair amount that can be helpful for you, and there's even a couple chapters in here on vertebrate pest control. Again, this can be helpful for you to train your workers to prepare for either your state exams and also prepare for maybe your certification exams. Those of you looking to become an ACE or perhaps a BCE, whatever the case may be, these can be helpful. Or you're just wanting to make sure that you lock in information on pests that affect urban environments. One more thing I wanted to add, they have very cleverly written summaries of each division. They'll talk a little bit about subterranean termites. Like in chapter 7, they'll have a page and a half on subterranean termites where they overview basic concepts. And that alone can be a valuable way to reactivate learning that you've had in the past. They're very smartly written. Now, I want to be clear, those introductions to each chapter won't necessarily help you answer the questions, but they are well written to help you if you need to tell your workers, let's learn a little bit about the fundamentals of subterranean termites. Well, that page and a half is like a cliff notes about some key elements and issues related to subterranean termites that can be helpful for them. It can help be a beautiful introduction. And I think their introduction to urban pest management in general was superbly written. And if you're looking for a justification for your job and you want what does it mean to be an urban pest control person and why is it important and what do you do? Those 4 or 5 pages are worth a lot, in my opinion. They're very smartly written. In a time when many academics never found a word they didn't want to write down, this book is the height of succinctness. It's written smartly, easily, and I think you'll find a lot of these questions very useful. Not making any money on this book, just so you know, but Daniel Dye is a friend of mine. I can't say he's a close friend, but he is a friend of mine. But I do recommend the book for those of you who are doing urban pest control. And it does have a couple chapters on vertebrate pest control as well. So hope you find that useful for you. Again, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Do take a few moments, subscribe to the channel. Join us over on Facebook for the Pest Geek Podcast group there. Definitely join us. Tell us about your triumphs and your trials and your questions. We'll try to answer those there as well. Of course, if you also have questions you'd like me to cover on the Living the Wildlife podcast, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. And again, take care and be safe out there. This is Stephen Vantassel, Living the Wildlife. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.